Today, I'll be starting my look into resource extraction in order to satisfy the contract, extract ore from the moon and deliver it to Kerbin. This contract requires me to land a large amount of moon ore on Kerbin's surface, which is no small task. As such, this contract will be split over 2 episodes. This video will center around the building and launching of a vessel capable of hauling the required amount of ore. In addition, I'll be taking a close look at the various resource scanners the game provides to help you locate the areas of high ore concentration. The next episode will then focus on the extracting of the ore, as well as looking at how to refine that ore in situ into useful resources. Let's get started. We'll start once again by taking a look at our contract, extract ore from the moon, and deliver it to Kerbin. And going in here and taking a look at these objectives. Objective number 1, acquire 2,550 units of fresh ore from the moon. So fresh means you actually do have to extract it from the moon's surface. And just to let you know, 2,450 units of ore is a lot. It's 25 tons of a lot, in fact. So do realize this is not a trivial contract. You are picking this one up. Anyway, you have to have that 2,550 units of ore in your vessel. You must land that ore on Kerbin, then maintain stability for 10 seconds, and then the contract is complete, and then you can recover it at that point. And you do get some money from the recovery of that ore. I mean, money that, you went out and you collected something and brought it back, and they give you some cash for that. But whether that is enough money to justify this mission, I'll have to leave that up to you. Anyway, taking a look at the tech tree. So once again, I will zoom out a little bit so that you can see the entire tree and see where it is that I am at. Now, this contract will only spawn after you unlocked advanced science, which I unlocked some time ago for the GravMax negative gravity detector. But what also comes with this is all of this mining stuff. So you get some ore holding cans, you get your 2 sizes of drills, the big one and the junior little one, and you get 2 sizes of convertitrons to convert that ore into useful resources. And we will be talking about the convertitrons too in the second part of this little 2-part series. So in order to do this contract, you do need to have advanced science tech, but then again, if you don't have advanced science tech, I can't expect that the contract will spawn at all. But I'm also going to unlock the node before it, scanning tech for 300 science, and I'm going to grab this because it comes with the M700 survey scanner. We're going to talk about exactly what this does. It is one of the tools that is there to help you find high concentrations of ore on the surface of bodies. There are actually 2 other tools there to help you. There is the surface scanning module, and there is also, if you go all the way to experimental science, the M4435 narrow band scanner that also help you zero in on where that really high concentration of ore is. And we'll talk about those later in this video. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock scanning tech because I do want to properly have the M700 survey scanner for this mission. So unlock that. Let's get started with our build. Now, I have myself a pretty awesome space station in a polar orbit of the moon. This was built over the course of 3 previous episodes, and I want to take advantage of it being there. So here's the plan. First, we're going to build a tug capable of holding all the ore we need for the contract and bringing it down to the surface of Kerbin. That tug will then be docked with the station. Next episode, I'm going to build a lander that will be able to extract the ore from the surface of the moon and bring it up to the station, where I'll transfer the ore to the tug and bring it back to Kerbin to satisfy the contract. This will leave the lander at the station, giving me the option to extract more ore in the future should I want to. That said, this will work without a station. The tug can just be parked in orbit of the moon by itself, and the lander will still be able to dock with it and transfer over the ore. But I like space stations. So let's get started. We're going to start with the Octo 2 probe core. This is going to be an autonomous vehicle. No Kerbals are going to be in it. And I'm going to put that inside a 1.25 meter service bay. Also inside is going to go a Z200 battery, a Communitron 16 antenna, and then on top is going to go a Clampetron docking port. And then I want to build a little bit of structure here before we get into the actual part that's going to be holding the ore. So I'm going to go into structural, and I'm grabbing one of these modular girders, going to flip it upside down so that connects nicely to the 1.25 meter size there. And then I'm going to put another one right underneath that. And for solar generation, it's not going to need much, so I'm just going to go with 4 Oxstat solar panels. Then a set of advanced inline stabilizers, and there's going to be some docking involved, so I'm going to put on some monopropellant cans, the Stratus 5 roundified monopropellant can. I'm going to put on, actually, I'm going to put on 4 of them. I'm leaving this space here on the side. You'll see why in a second. Now, it's not like I need 4 for the docking here, but this thing's going up to our station, and I neglected to put on a good monoprop reserve, so we're actually going to get our engineer on the station to swipe these while we're up there. Now, if I did unlock that experimental science node in the tech tree for 1000 science, I would have gotten a nice 2.5 meter ore holding tank, which actually would have been helpful in this mission, but I'm deliberately keeping this a little lower tech. If you want to use the bigger tanks, by all means do so, but all I have are these smaller ones. So for instance, I'm going to put this guy on here. That can only hold 300 units of ore. Going to put on another one like that, so now I'm up to 600 units of ore. And to get my 2,450 units, what I'm going to do is grab these radial ones, and we're going to go onto 8-way symmetry, and we're going to put on 3 rows of these, just like so. And if I add on 2 more, just need 2 more up here on the top, this is why I saved these 2 spots, that gets me 2,550 units of ore. So if I can manage to fill these up and bring this back safely to Kerbin, this is going to satisfy the contract. Now notice, this is one of the few containers that when you put them on, they are empty, because the idea is that you're going out and recovering ore from someplace else. But if you want, you can actually put ore in there if you want to, and we'll be taking advantage of that in just a little bit. But for now, we're going to finish off this module of this whole thing by putting on at the bottom a 2.5 meter heat shield, because this thing is going to need to re-enter. And also what it's going to need are parachutes. And in fact, it's going to need quite a lot of parachutes. If we go over to our parachutes here, we take a look at our parachutes. The biggest parachute we got is this Mark 16 XL parachute. And the thing I want to draw attention to is this fully deployed effective diameter of 51.2, let's say, meters. But whatever. 51.2, let's say, meters. That is when it's fully deployed. What is that effective diameter? Now, drag is directly proportional to cross-sectional area. An area is proportional to the diameter squared. Now the question is, how much cross-sectional area do you need? Well, to give yourself an idea, this Mark 16 parachute, Mark 16 XL parachute, is really designed to go atop the Mark 1-3 command pod. And the Mark 1-3 command pod is in the ballpark of about 2.5 tons. As I mentioned, we're going to be bringing back 25 tons of ore, and that's not even counting the sort of weight of all the rest of this stuff that we put on here. We're going to need at least 10 times the amount of drag that can be provided by this parachute. So here's how we're going to accomplish that. We're going to grab, because they're easier to get a bunch of them on here, we're going to grab the Mark II-R radially mounted parachute. It's not as big as the XL. You can see here it has a fully deployed effective diameter of 41.3 meters. So it is a little bit smaller, but that's okay. It makes it's actually easier to get on here. And what we're going to do is we're going to put on 4 of them, just like so. And then above that, we're going to put 6 more. And we'll do a little bit of translating, a little bit of rotating so that they're not completely clipping into each other. So all told here, we have 10 of these radial parachutes, and we're not done yet. I'm going to grab these drogue parachutes. Because this thing is so much mass, it's going to need all the help it can get slowing down, even high up in the atmosphere. And the drogue chutes are specifically designed to be deployed higher in the atmosphere and at higher velocity, so that it will slow down the craft enough so that the main parachutes can then be deployed. And we're going to be putting on 6 of them. Now, if you right click on any parachute, you do have some things that you can adjust with the parachute. Now, first of all, I left all these on the default, so I didn't change anything. But if you want to, you can change these things. This might come into effect if you have a heavier vessel than this one or in a different atmosphere than Kerbin. So let's go over these just really quickly. The minimum pressure is the pressure at which the parachute will initially deploy in that reefed position. 1 is the atmospheric pressure at sea level on Kerbin. So you can see here it's set at 0.02. The lower the number, the higher in the atmosphere that parachute will deploy. So for instance, if we take a look at this radial parachute, it's at 0.04. That's a higher number, so it will deploy at a lower altitude than the drogue parachutes, which makes perfect sense. The second number here is the actual altitude in meters measured above the terrain. So it's that radar altitude. So the drogue parachute will fully deploy when it's 2,500 meters above the ground. And then finally, the last one is the spread angle. This will, if you put it at 0, the parachute will be straight up above wherever you have the part. If you put it at 10, I'm not exactly sure what the 10 means, but that's the furthest spread out you can have. This is purely an aesthetic thing. It will in no way affect the parachute, but if you find that you just don't like the fact that all the parachutes are on top of each other, you can start spreading some of them out if you like. But as I said, I left these all in the defaults, and these just work just fine. And rest assured, I tested this before performing this actual mission. Alt F12 is your friend. I actually put this thing in an orbit about the moon and put it on a trajectory into Kerbin's atmosphere to make sure that it would survive that re-entry. And I advise you, if you're doing anything besides just copying me, to do exactly the same. So this is the part that's going to be coming back to Kerbin's surface. Now what we need to do is get it out to the station and get it back. But remember, it's going to go out there in a very different state in which it comes back. It's going to go out there with all of these ore tanks empty, and it's going to come back with all of those ore tanks full. So the mass difference is going to be quite substantial. How are we going to deal with that? Well, I'll get to that in just a little bit, but the getting out there part, well, that's really familiar. I've gone out to that station a whole bunch of times, so I just did what I know will work. I put on a TD-25 decoupler, and then I grabbed 4 of these Rockomax X200-8 tanks, and I'll explain why I'm not using the bigger tanks in just a little bit. And also, I know with all of this ore, it's going to be very heavy coming home. Normally, I would probably slap a poodle under this, but for this guy, I'm going to be slapping on the RE-I5 Skipper liquid fuel engine because I'm going to need that extra thrust. And finally, this thing is going to need to do some docking, so I put on a total of 8 RV-105 RCS thruster blocks. And now if I go over here, and it's 2,428 meters per second of vacuum delta V, which seems like a lot. Now don't forget, this thing needs to come back. To come back from the moon's orbit and get into Kerbin's atmosphere costs about 280 meters per second of delta V. But remember, when it comes back, these tanks are going to be full of ore. So how do I go about figuring out, well, exactly, like it seems like I have a lot, but I'm going out empty and I'm coming back full, so it's going to be heavier coming back. How do I figure that stuff all out? Well, it really isn't that bad. What you need to do is realize, okay, for my budget, I'm going to be spending about 2,140 meters per second to get out there. So take what you got so far, 2,428, and subtract off the 2,140. And that gets you 288 meters per second for the return. But it's really less than that because on the return, it's going to have these things all full. To figure out exactly how much full you're going to be, just go into these tanks and start removing fuel until you get your delta V in around that 288 range. So that'll end up removing most of this fuel. There we go, that's pretty close there. And then if I fill this full of ore, to start making sure I get every one of these tanks, this now adds in the weight of all of that ore. You can see that I really only have 95 meters per second for the trip home. So I need to add on more tanks. So what do? Oh well, I'll just lift this up. We'll stick in another tank, another one of these. Just like that, okay? And so now you might be saying, oh, now I got 386 meters per second for the trip home. Not quite there, because this fuel that we just added would have been on there from the beginning, so we would have used up more fuel because we also had to haul up this fuel. So how do I go about figuring it out? Well, I go through and I repeat this whole process. I take out all the ore that I just put in, so that now I have no ore left in any of these tanks. I put all that fuel back in that I just took out, so that now all these tanks are again full. I now look at my delta V of 2,758. I subtract off the 2,140 that it would take to get me out to the moon. That leaves me with 618. I start removing fuel from here until my delta V gets in around 618. That represents the fuel that is used to get myself out there towards the moon. I then put in my ore to find out how much delta V I really have for the return journey. And I can see now that I only have 214 meters per second for the return journey. And remember, I need 280. And you just keep repeating this process. This is why I was using these small tanks, because it makes it really easy for me to just keep adding more of them. And it turns out what ended up working was just one more of these tanks that actually provided the fuel that I needed. I'm not going to go through that process again. But you can just take my word for it that ended up leaving me with enough for the fuel for the return journey. But unfortunately, because our payload is changing at different stages of this mission, this is the way you have to kind of go through it. So again, I'm going to make sure I got all that ore out. I'm going to make sure all these tanks are then... Actually, I'm not going to make sure that all these tanks are then full, because I can now look at this and say, I can keep the 6 X200-8s. Functionally, actually, it's still exactly the same, but why don't I actually instead replace that with an X200-16 and an X200-32. That is exactly the same amount of fuel, and in fact, it's also the same amount of mass. Let's keep the RCS blocks too. So there's no structural advantage to doing this, but we're going to do it anyway. And after some texture tweaking and the addition of a few blinky lights, our transfer vehicle was complete. Now we need to prepare it for its ascent through Kerbin's atmosphere, and that involved putting on top an upside down 2.5 meter fairing. I then added on a pair of separatrons with most of the fuel removed. Slid them in there underneath, so a little bit out of sight, and then took one of them, removed the symmetry, and then moved it a little bit further than the other, so that when this detaches and these go off, the thrust is going to be asymmetric, which will blow the top of this off to one side, so it won't be in our way. And to top this off, we just got one of these big 2.5 meter nose cones, built the fairing, and then came the time to put on a booster to get this thing into low Kerbin orbit. And I got, I think, a little bit lazy here. I put on 4 identical radial boosters. Each of these boosters are just a LVB KR-1x2 twin bore liquid fuel engine, on top of which went the slanted 2.5 to 1.25 meter fuel tank, and then the slanted nose cone on top of that. They are connected onto the booster with a TT-70 radial decoupler, and for aerodynamic stability, I put on a total of 8 of these AV-T1 winglets on the boosters. When you put on winglets like this, keep the snap on and pay attention to the texture so that they're in the same position on each of these boosters all the way around. I have all 5 of these engines all going off at launch, and I'm using some asparagus staging. And if you want to get some more information on exactly how to set up asparagus staging, you can check out this video here. But the long and the short of it is just this. What I have is a fuel line that goes from this booster, it's right here, to this booster here, which means that as these engines are running, fuel is being pumped from this booster into this booster, and then from this booster into the central core, and the same thing on the other side. What that means is although all 5 of these engines are running, all the fuel is being drained only from this booster and its partner on the other side. When these boosters are empty, we stage, they go away. Notice these separatrons I placed up here to help push them away. Then we'll be running off of these fuel tanks on this one and this one, so it'll be on 3 engines. Again, all the engines will be running off of these 2 tanks. When they're empty, they stage, and these ones go away, and then we'll be running off the central core. As far as doing a little bit of tweaks on the engines, if I go to this stage here, I tweaked down these twin bores because I found this thrust to weight was defaulting a little bit too high, so I tweaked it down 43.5% of full thrust, and then I wanted a sea level thrust to weight ratio of 1.33, and that involved tweaking down this one to just 22. Now the fact that I'm tweaking them down as far as that means I have way too much engine. I could have gotten away with smaller tanks and smaller engines to lift this payload, but what can I say? I kind of got lazy and just put on these big boys. But with that, this thing was ready to go. As this mission is identical to the other missions that brought up modules for the station, I won't be going over it in detail here. If you need to, check out the videos linked to earlier. What I will do though is extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has been supporting this channel. I especially want to thank my most recent Patreon patrons and YouTube members: William Carney, Droidling, Michael Homer, James F. Berube, Limit, Connor Pendergrast, C-Lab, J. Crown, and Ross McClellan. And if you would like to be a member of the team that directly supports this channel, you will find the appropriate links down there in the description. My ascent was more efficient than I anticipated, leaving me with 2 of those radio boosters still attached at the start of my lunar injection burn. Don't worry about it if you found you staged these boosters while making orbit. There will still be plenty of fuel left in the transfer vehicle. In fact, some of you may be realizing this station has a very large supply of liquid fuel and oxidizer aboard that I could have used to refuel this vessel for the return journey. But I didn't factor that into my design in case you don't have such a station in lunar orbit. Actually, before we dock, just a very quick reminder about action wheels and how they can fight each other on stations. So be prepared when you're docking in modules, especially heavy kind of pendulum-ish modules like this one. You most certainly want to be ready to toggle off those reaction wheels so that reaction wheels on the station pointing in different directions are not fighting with each other. I should do it right there. Nicey nice. So we'll toggle the torque on those reaction wheels. And if you find your station is wobbling, mine's pretty steady, but if you find it's wobbling, one thing that freezes all kind of rotational attitude type physics is if you just do a quick time warp, it actually freezes everything in place. And quite often, if you have a wobble that you can't seem to get under control, that's a fix for it. It was then Bill's job to take the extra monopropellant we brought up and attach it to our station reserves. But before we get to the job of harvesting ore from the surface, we'd best find out where that ore is. And that means returning to the VAB to build ourselves a survey satellite. So we'll start once again with an Octo 2 probe core, and under that we're going to put a small set of the reaction wheels. And then on top of this, under science, we're going to get our new M700 survey scanner. So we'll put this up here. It's not particularly heavy, only 200 kilograms, but it is rather large. Let's deploy it. This is what it looks like once it is deployed. So you are going to want to get this under a fairing. But let's take a look over here at some of the details that come with this part. You need to get it into orbit, and what you're going to do a resource scan, and that scan is going to take 5 seconds. And there are some orbital parameters here. The minimum altitude is 25 kilometers. Unless the body radius divided by 10 is bigger, for the moon that's not an issue because the moon is 200 kilometers. So if you divide that by 10, that's 20 kilometers, which is less than 25. But if you were, for instance, putting this in orbit around Kerbin, which has a radius of 600 kilometers divided by 10 is 60, then you need to put it in a minimum altitude at least 60 kilometers. Maximum altitude is 1,500 kilometers unless the body radius times 5 is smaller. Again, going with it with the moon, 200 kilometers. 200 kilometers times 5 is 1,000 kilometers. That's smaller, so I actually have to stay below 1,000 kilometers. But 25 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, that's quite a range, and it makes no difference where you are there. I'm going to go for a 100 kilometer orbit. But there are a couple of things here it doesn't tell you. One is that this orbit has to be polar. There's nothing here that I see that tells you that it has to be a polar orbit. And in fact, you won't find that out until you get out there, go to run the scanner, and it'll say, if you're not in a polar orbit, dude, you need to be in a polar orbit. Kind of unfortunate that that's not here. So do know that. Must be in a polar orbit. How close to 90 degrees of an inclination you need to be, I'm not entirely sure. My suspicion is the game gives you quite a bit of wiggle room. The other thing it doesn't tell you is that, okay, the scan takes 5 seconds, that's great, but the scan takes more than 200 units of electric charge, and again, that runs really quickly, and there's nothing in here telling you this. So it doesn't tell you that, oh, we're going to use this much electricity per second for 5 seconds. No, it doesn't do that. You need to make sure you have more than 200 units of electricity aboard in order to cover this scan. Again, it's kind of unfortunate that you probably wouldn't find that out until you actually ran the scan, and then it tells you, oh, by the way, you just ran out of electricity. And depending upon how you have your settings, that could actually be quite bad. So we're going to get 2 of these Z400 batteries, and we're going to stick them just under here, and that is 400 units of electricity. That'll cover it. Once you do the one scan, this thing doesn't use electricity anymore, and the electrical requirements it needs other than for the scanner are pretty trivial. It's just for running the reaction wheels and stuff like that. So a collection of Oxtat solar panels are more than going to do the job. Other than that, the rest of this build is spectacularly simple compared to what you've seen lately out of this series. Added on a Communitron 16 antenna, which is necessary, by the way, for the antenna to work, so make sure you do not forget that. Under that went an Oscar B fuel can, and then a cubic octagonal strut, and then a 48-7S Spark liquid fuel engine. Then attached radially went 3 R-4 dumpling fuel cans. That finishes off the satellite, and the lifter was spectacularly simple, starting with TD-060 coupler, 1.25 meter fairing, advanced set of reaction wheels, underneath of which went 3 FL-T400 fuel tanks, 4 basic tail fins for stability, and then on the bottom the LV-T45 swivel liquid fuel engine, and this is all she needs. And as this is even a simpler mission than the previous one, because there's nothing for us to rendezvous or dock with, all we have to do is make sure we put ourselves into a polar orbit of the moon and that the altitude of that orbit is within the specified range. And once that is accomplished, it's time for us to run our scanner. Make sure our batteries are charged before we go. We are good, so we're going to click on the scanner. We're going to right-click that context menu there, and the first thing to notice here is the Deploy Scanner button, which does that. And then you can see there's a whole lot of other options here. In fact, I'm going to just point it at the moon so you can see what's going to happen. What you need to do first here, though, is you need to perform that orbital survey. So you just click that and off it goes. This takes a few seconds to happen, and notice our electricity going down while that's happening. But this is going to be it as far as electricity that's required. So as long as you have enough batteries on here, you're good. There we go. That is done. And we'll take a look at the moon. That is our resource. So it's a little bit awkward to see here, but the brighter the colors, the more resources are in that area. If we take a look here and click on the resource button, it tells us that average ore percentage is 5.38%, but that will vary wildly over the surface of the moon. We can change the color of this overlay by just simply pressing the color button. So now we can make it inverse, which is green. We can change it to a heat map, which personally I kind of prefer better. This one is heat map green. We also have heat map blue, and back to the monochrome again. Now what's really, I kind of like this one, the heat map green. What's really, I think even more useful is right now the cutoff is 0%, which means it's showing the entire surface of the moon. But if we up the cutoff to 10%, now it's no longer showing the bottom 10% of the moon's surface. 20%. 30%, now you can see there's nothing in this zone at all for us to go find. 40%, 50%, 60%, and 70%. 80%, and then finally at the end here, it goes to 90%, but now there's nothing on the moon here that's 90%. And we can go back to that. And if you want, you can turn that off by just simply toggling the overlay like that. But it does get a little better because it's hard to see. You can't see the whole moon from here. If we go into map view and go over here and click on the moon little icon here on the side, this little about the moon icon, and there's all kinds of things. But notice now that there's a resources section. There's a resource tab. If you click on the resources, which there's only ever one in the stock game, which is ore, it puts it on from out here, and now I can see the entire thing. It actually even gives you a couple more options for you to do. You can change the style to dotted, to a solid colors, and to lines like this. That's kind of a personal preference, whatever it is that you like. And you can also increase the overlays, or the cutoff here. It's at 60% right now. Now it's at 70%. Now it's at 80%. So this will give you some idea of where are some good places for you to land. So for instance, this red area here definitely looks like a very high concentration of ore. This green area here, much less so. And these yellow areas are somewhere in between. And now that we have finished this scan, we don't have to stick with this vessel. We can see this from the tracking station. And if we pop on over to the moon by hitting the tab button, let's actually turn all of this off. Again, we have the same moon button, planetary buddy button here. Click on the ore. There's your ore. Turn up the cutoff. You have all the same values, so you can get the same view from the tracking station for your planning purposes. And if you want to lose that, just click on the ore button again and that will disappear. So that's the M700 survey scanner. It is good for body-wide surveys. But what if we wanted to know more detail about a specific area? There are two other scanners just for that. So let's take a quick look at them, starting with a satellite featuring the M4435 narrow band scanner. So there we have the moon there right below us, and if we right click on our scanner here, we can say deploy the scanner, and off it goes. It again does not use very much electricity, so just these little oxstats is perfectly fine for it. Here, let's pin this over here. It is highly recommended that you do put this into a polar orbit. It actually isn't required, but the advantage, of course, of a polar orbit is that you will be going over the entire surface of the moon. And that's important because if I put on our KerbNet access here, we get this little view, but this view is only what is directly below us. Now I can adjust the field of view. I can make it really narrow to kind of zoom in, and if you hit the refresh button there to zoom in immediately below us, or I can make the field of view very, very wide so I actually can see this whole half of the moon. But it doesn't survey the entire, it's only what's below you. And this little crosshairs here is exactly what's below you. It's also telling us that the region below us has an average ore percentage of 4.88%, which is below the moon average of 5.89%. So we can tell we are not over a very good region for mining. And that kind of what the idea is that you're using this scanner in conjunction with the M700 scanner that we just talked about previously, but I still have access to that information. If I pop over here to map view, then center my view on the moon by simply double clicking on it, all of a sudden now I get that same orbital, let's move this guy out of the way. We'll get that same moon button that we had before. I have the resource icon and I can turn that back on. I got all the same functions, so I can turn that cutoff back up to, I think I had it at 80%. Change the colors back to that heat map that I like so much, and then I just come back out of the map view and I still have that available to me here. But the whole idea here, if I turn back on my KerbNet access, is to take a look here, look for these high zones, and then try and zoom right in, try to get some more fine detail, for instance, on this high zone. So this is really useful if you happen to be wanting to build a base. So let's time warp a little bit here. I can see this now coming up ahead of me. I can hit the refresh here. Now I can see this high concentration area coming up. It's 5.89% right now below me. Maybe if I time warp a little bit further ahead, refresh that again, 9.74%. And if you get to a spot that you think, oh, this is a really good spot, this is a really nice hot spot, there is a waypoint button that you can drop, and it will put a waypoint right here at the spot that you just went over. So now if I go to map view, you can see here's that waypoint that I just dropped. If you don't end up liking that waypoint, you can later on delete them. But once you have one that you're happy with, but you really want to dial in and find that perfect spot for that resource harvesting base, well, that's where the surface scanning module comes in. You can see here with the rover, I have still the M4435 narrowband scanner because it still works here on the surface. In fact, I can see from here that, if I hit refresh again, oh, now it's really over there towards the west. This looks like a hot area for me to investigate. But then what I also have aboard is the surface scanner, which you can use to run an analysis of exactly right where you are. So if you click run that analysis, it will give you the ore percentage right where you are. And this is really useful if you want to make a mining base and you want to put that base in a really nice high percentage spot. And one last thing when it comes to this ore percentage is as you mine out the ore, this percentage doesn't drop. It remains a constant. There is an unlimited amount of ore, so you can, with just a single base, mine as much ore as you want. But with that, let's take this opportunity to go over the main takeaways from this episode. A good chunk of this tutorial was devoted to building an ore hauler, in particular how to determine the required parachutes to safely recover something so massive, and how to determine the fuel requirements when the payload dramatically changes mass from one leg of the journey to another. In the later part of the video, I looked at using the resource scanners, taking a particularly close look at the M700 scanner. Not just how to use it, but also its rather sneaky orbit and electricity requirements. Finally, I finished off with a quick look at the M4435 narrowband scanner and the surface scanner, both of which are there to help you dial in the exact locations of high ore concentration. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. Make sure to catch the next one where I will be building this ore drilling lander and completing the contract by recovering the harvested ore. I hope to see you then.